Let's change the pace. Let's stop looking back at the tragic events in Paris of last week and look forward to events next year. Here in London, the fight to be mayor, one of the biggest tests perhaps of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, but it's not Labour we're talking about, it's the Conservatives. And the candidate, and also of course MP for Richmond Park and North Kingston, Zac Goldsmith is in the studio with me. Zac, welcome. Thank you for coming along this morning. Not at all. Always welcome here, sir. A lot of calls coming in and we'll get to those in just a second, but I understand you've got an initiative as regards London taxis, London taxi drivers. What is it, Mr Goldsmith?
Look, we want to, a lot of people love and want to use black cabs. One of the barriers, it's not the only barrier, but one of the barriers is that you feel that you need to have cash. Only half the cabs use card terminals. I want to ensure that very soon after the election, if I'm elected, every single cab takes cards, ideally contactless payments, and it would remove any doubt in people's minds, and it'll help the black cab potentially tip the balance in their favour at a time when, as you know, they're struggling very seriously.
In practical terms, how are you going to do this?
Well, you can do it at zero cost to the cabbie. That's the thing. You're 22,500 cabs in London, so you can do a deal with the card terminal providers very, very easily. Some of them already offer 2%, some of them, but at the moment there is no free option. And if you combine the buying power of TfL, the fact that you've got 22,500 cabs, you could do it at zero cost to the cabbie, and I would commit to that.
Where are you on the Uber row, Mr Goldsmith?
Well, Uber is an important part of the competition. So I think anyone talking about banning Uber is, one, it's probably very unrealistic, and two, I'm not sure it's a good thing. It is a low-cost alternative to some people. The problem is that it's not a fair competition at the moment. You've got the most heavily regulated cab service on the one hand, with huge costs mandated by regulations on the black cab drivers, and they're having to compete on what looks like an even playing field with Uber, and it's not a fair competition. You've got the turning circle, the knowledge, you've got wheelchair access. All these things are required by law of the black cabs. None of those things are required of Uber. So if you either have to strip away those regulations, which would mean getting rid of the black cab altogether, which would be a tragedy, I think, for London, or you create a distinction between the two. And you can't. It's one or the other. I would favour creating that distinction, maintaining that distinction, so that the black cab has a future. I think it's an incredibly valuable and valued service in London. So
what does that mean for Uber?
Well, I don't go as far. TfL proposed recently the idea of having a sort of mandatory 5-minute waiting time, which I think would annoy customers, it would annoy Londoners, and it would create a dynamic where it's effectively the people versus black cabs. That's not a good thing. That's what's happened in New York. So I wouldn't go that far, but I do think we need to look I think we need to limit the number of licenses that are issued.
Well, now, Boris Johnson has spoken about this many times, and indeed
he's been pushing for it.
Yeah, but it needs to be there needs to be action, but it needs to be an act of Parliament.
But it needs to be government, exactly. So he's putting a lot of pressure, as am I, talking to ministers. It's not that complicated. The government can make it possible very easily.
It operates in other cities. Brighton, I think, they have a finite number, and elsewhere.
Absolutely right. So you can do that, and 2,500 licenses issued a month is way too much. It's also causing congestion. What I'd like to see is the mayor to have the power to limit the number, and also you can be a bit more prescriptive. You can say, look, there are so many at the moment that we're only going to issue new licenses to electric cabs, for example. Deal with two problems at the same time. It's not that complicated, but it does require government action.
Okay, so put your headphones on. We're taking the calls now. Clem is in Maida Vale. You're through to Zac Goldsmith. Go ahead, Clem.
Morning, Clem.
Good morning, Zac.
What's your question, Clem?
Good morning, Zac.
Morning, Clem.
Yes, I have a question for you about knife crime.
Yeah.
Do you have any plans about knife crime in light of what has been happening recently? It's not only affecting children who are in gangs, it's affecting everyone now.
Yeah, absolutely right.
We're looking at a city now, as you'll be aware, Mr Goldsmith, 13 fatal stabbings in London, and of course events in Dulwich, of which you're probably aware. There's a teenager in critical condition in a hospital in South London after 3 teenagers were caught up in a fight in a school in Dulwich that also knife crime is involved. Mr Goldsmith. It is.
Look, it's a growing problem. So there has been a spike in knife crime in the last few months. There's been a spike in most forms of crime, actually, in the last few months in London. So the first priority, and this matters now because we've only got a week or so to negotiate, the first priority is to make sure we get a good deal from government to fund our policing. If some of the higher cuts being proposed are enacted, we would lose a considerable number of police in London. That would make it much, much harder. And I suspect you would then see an even bigger spike in these kinds of crimes, which absolutely rip communities apart. So money matters, and that's the first priority. That's the most immediate priority. But it's not just that. We have a tougher sentencing approach, thanks to Nick's colleague and my colleague, Nick Dubois, who campaigned as a backbencher. 2 strikes and you're out with knives. I think that will help police. It'll create a bigger disincentive. But I also, and I know this is controversial, and I know I get attacked every time I say it, but I do think we need to look again at what's happened with stop and search. We've gone from way too much, where individuals have felt harassed and and abused by the police, to the other extreme where people now feel that they can walk around with knives with impunity. And I think we've lost the balance, and that's certainly the message coming out of the police. And I would take what they're saying very seriously.
So how would you make the balance right?
Well, there is a line somewhere there, and I'm not going to pretend I'm a policing expert, because I'm not, but I take very seriously what I'm told by the police at all levels, and their view is that the pendulum has swung too far away from stop and search. So I think it's about finding that balance, but it's somewhere between the two extremes that we've experienced over the last few years.
The Commissioner, Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe, was sitting in that chair earlier this week. He said he'd struggle to cope if numbers dropped below 30,000. If you were London Mayor, what would you do with the Home Secretary, with the Chancellor? How would you ensure that didn't happen?
Well, I am applying maximum pressure, and I know that all my London colleagues are, London MPs. I know Boris Johnson is as well. Ultimately, you've got to make do with what the government gives you. But until that decision is made, it's about putting as much pressure as possible. I agree with Bernard Hogan-Howe. I rate him really highly. I think he's a brilliant figure, and I think we have to take what he said seriously, not just because of knife crime and low-level crime like antisocial behaviour, but all the way to the top. This is about terrorism as well. You talk to people in counter-terrorism, they'll tell you that the computer surveillance and phone interception, all that matters, but it's the really valuable information comes from neighbourhood policing. If you lose neighbourhood policing, you're really at a disadvantage. And I think in a world that is becoming increasingly dangerous, that would be a very risky thing to do. So my message to the government is we need a good deal. There will be cuts, we know that, but the kinds of cuts being proposed, anything up to £1 billion over the next 4 years, are not reconcilable with a proper police service.
What do we need to learn from the events in Paris as regards police and police spending, Mr. Goldsmith?
Well, I think I don't want to repeat what I just said, but it is that we need to be properly resourced. The PM responded to what happened in Paris by saying that we're going to have more money for counter-terrorism, more money for the intelligence services, more money for airport security, and that is all good news. But if you lose your neighbourhood policing at the same time, then you lose a really important link. So the message is we need a decent, comprehensive neighbourhood police force in London. If we don't have that, I don't think we can feel as safe as we are entitled to feel.
David, coming to your call in just a second. Final question for now, Mr. Goldsmith. You're Mayor Goldsmith, and God forbid the sort of events we saw in Paris a week ago tonight happened in London. What's the first thing you do?
I mean, the first thing you have to do is take stock. But I think the job of the mayor is, it's not just about the licensed authority of being mayor. I think you have to use the platform, use the position to try and pull London together, to unite London. I mean, one of the great things that happened after the atrocities we experienced in London, I remember I was in hospital at the time, not connected. I wasn't fortunately caught up in all that stuff. But London came together in a magnificent way, an extraordinary show of defiance, dignified defiance. And that is something which I think the mayor, and to give him his credit, I think Ken Livingstone, he reacted very well at the time. He gave a brilliant speech.
He did.
It was very moving, and I think he absolutely got the tone right, and London rallied.
More calls. David in West Sussex. You're through to Zac Goldsmith. Go ahead, David.
Hello, hi, good morning to you both.
Morning.
Unfortunately, I have a million questions I'd like to ask, but can I just put it down to 3 bullet points?
Yeah.
160 million spent on the supercycle highway. How many houses could have been built in London for that, for the indigenous workers? I just want to mention about this guy Gilligan this morning, who was an absolute idiot.
Okay, now just a reference, I'm not cutting you off, Andrew Gilligan, who of course you'll know, he appeared on this show. We had a report with political editor Theo Usherwood at Mr. Goldsmith, who we also know, and we stationed him down at the latest bit of the cycle superhighway with a clipboard, that's right, and he was counting the number of cyclists who were not using the cycle superhighway because they're not mandated to do, and Mr. Gilligan got in a rather nasty row about all of that and questioned whether Mr. Usherwood is telling the truth. David, back to you on your final bullet point for Zac Goldsmith.
Okay, it's the motorists and truck drivers are all penalised for driving in London, and they're all mandated. Why are cyclists not? They should be. They're not being mandated to use this appalling highway that's been created. I mean, what is the point of doing it if they're not going to use it?
Mr. Goldsmith.
So I didn't hear your run-in with Andrew Gilligan earlier, so I can only speculate.
We'll download it for you.
I will be listening to it. I will certainly be listening to it. Look, it is a lot of money, but the reality is that London population is going to grow over the next 10 years by about 1.5 million people. If all those people get into cars, London will stop. It'll simply grind to a standstill. So they need to use alternatives, and that means growing the transport infrastructure, the big stuff like tubes, but also making better use of buses and getting people onto bikes. So it is right that we should be doing everything we can to make cycling safer, friendlier, and so on. Now, I hear from cyclists all the time, not the campaign groups, who are quite hard to deal with, actually. And I think the fact that...
In what way hard to deal with that?
Look, but Boris is the most cycle-friendly politician Britain has ever known in the history of our... And yet he's still savaged day in, day out by the cycling lobby.
You saw him getting the finger, did you, in the papers?
He's described as a murderer, has got blood on his hands. And actually, but there is no one in the history of our country who's done more for cycling than Boris has. And I will defend that to the hilt. So I think there is a sort of unreasonableness there at times. But ordinary cyclists, some of them are put off from using the cycle superhighway type structure because they think it's a bit aggressive. So the message I'm hearing particularly from mothers and wanting to take their kids to school, not drive, is that they favour things like the quiet ways, more residential routes, perhaps more windy but friendlier, safer, and also a hell of a lot cheaper. So I think we need a balance in all this. I think to be fair to the incumbent, I would like to see how these cycle superhighways work, see how much they're used. I don't think we should be dogmatic about it. If they work, fantastic. Get people onto bikes, get people healthy, relieve congestion, do all kinds of wonderful things. But we've got to see how these things work. And if Theo, was it Theo who did say? Well, if he, I will I'll talk to him after showing. I'll get the stats from him after this.
But shouldn't we?
But it's only been open for a very short time.
Sure. But shouldn't we mandate cycling?
Yeah, there is. I have to say, I can't think of a good reason not to. There may be one, and I will retain an open mind, as I always try and do, but it's a very strong argument.
Yeah. Okay, we go to other calls. Hoochie is in Battersea. Go ahead, Hoochie. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. Mr. Goldsmith, bearing in mind the congestion charge is £11.50 a day, do you intend to increase it? If so, by how much? And if not, do you intend to increase the congestion charge area?
No, I'm not a fan of I think the congestion charge did its job when it came in. It was quite a brave thing to do, actually, at the time, and it came in and it had an immediate impact, but then it plateaued. And it's that the technology is clunky, it's old, it costs about 300 million quid a year to manage it, including processing all the fines. It's not, in my view, fit for purpose as it is. So I certainly wouldn't consider expanding the congestion charge, and I don't think the fine needs to be increased. I don't think my impulse is not to look at every problem and try and find a way to increase or invent a new tax. But I do think that a bigger problem for London is air quality, and that is a problem that we need to deal with. And if we don't deal with it, incidentally, the government will, because there are legal obligations on London to deal with this problem, which is killing around 10,000 people every year prematurely. So the priority for me would be about accelerating a shift from polluting cars to the cleanest possible cars. We have all the tools we need to do that. It can be done. It can be done very quickly.
What are the tools?
Well, I mean, technology is the principal tool, but to put it in context, by 2018, every new black cab that comes onto the market will be electric. And I would take a much more bullish approach to the private hire vehicles as well. We talked about Uber earlier, but it's not just Uber. So the tools are there. You can get from London to Brighton and back again for less than £2 with an electric car. The problem today is convenience, a fear that the batteries aren't going to last, a fear that you're not going to be able to charge your battery. All those things can be overcome with technology, and the cost of the car itself is coming down very quickly. There isn't much of a second-hand market for them yet because they're relatively new, but there will be. It's developing, and the prices are coming down really quickly. It is inevitable that the majority of cars, at some point, even all cars, will be electric. I have no doubt about that, but the job of the mayor... That depends on so many different factors beyond the control of either of us in this room. But it will happen because that's the direction of travel. The job of the mayor and the local authorities working with government is to make sure that we accelerate that process. One of the things that I think we should be doing, there will be huge fines from VW, huge fines for having engaged in wide-scale corporate fraud. I'd like that money to be ring-fenced, to be used for an extended scrappage scheme to get the most polluted cars out of our cities, particularly London, which is where the problem is worst.
Would you ever support the idea of an increased congestion charge or even more license or whatever it might be on diesel cars? Because I understand diesels are...
We have... Boris has introduced the ultra-low emission zone, which comes in 2018. I hope I've got that right. I really ought to know. It's 2018 it's coming in.
Okay, we'll check.
I'll get a... Yes, it is. Good. I'm being nodded at. It's 2018, and that includes incentives on clean cars and financial disincentives on the most polluting cars. So, yeah, we absolutely need to get to a point where diesel is removed.
We move on to other calls. Louise in Amersham, you're through to Zac Goldsmith. Go ahead, Louise.
Morning, Louise.
Hello. Good morning to you both. I would just really like to go on back to what we were talking about earlier regarding the Paris attacks. And do you believe that the police should be carrying guns in light of what's happened?
Yeah, I certainly don't take the the Jeremy Corbyn line, which I think has been adjusted since, but I certainly don't. I mean, if there is a danger, the police need to do whatever it is they need to do in order to remove that danger, and
including shooting someone.
Absolutely, yeah, of course. And honestly, I don't think any reasonable person listening to this program today would disagree with that. If there are people who want to do harm to innocent people, then the police must be empowered and able to do whatever it takes to deal with them. I would be nervous about getting to a point where our police wander around like in the US with guns strapped to their hips, because that's not.
They do it at airports. They do it at railway stations.
And I support that. And in key areas of vulnerability, there's absolutely no reason why that shouldn't happen. But if you get to the point where your safer neighbourhood team walking through Barnes High Street have pistols and guns strapped around their waist, I think we'd have gone too far. So it's just common sense. There's no.
On the subject of arms and guns, you may have seen the piece in one of the papers, the Daily Mail, by Kevin Hurley, who's the police commissioner in Surrey, and he's a former counter-terrorism commander in the City of London Police. And he was saying France has 14 times the number of armed police as Britain, not just London, but France as Britain, and also have very different guns. He's very concerned that the canned guns that the Metropolitan Police use are quite slow. And in the old days of what was called contain and negotiate, that is, you got, for want of an IRA terrorist, you held them. It doesn't work now. These people just start shooting machine guns. Do you think we need a review of our level of arms?
I mean, I have to defer to him on this, obviously. If you ask me the difference in the quality of the different guns and which guns are appropriate, I'd be bluffing if I gave you an answer, because I just don't know. I don't carry guns, and I'm not licensed to do so. But I would certainly take what he has to say very, very seriously. I think one of the issues though in Paris, which I'm told again by police people in whom I have a lot of confidence, is that they have a much less sophisticated, much less organic neighborhood policing structure in Paris than we do here. And the same is true of the United States, where you have the sort of FBI, which is a completely separate level to the more local policing, and there's very little communication between the two. We have an integrated force here, and it's really important that we maintain that.
I spoke about this with John Stalker yesterday. He's former Deputy Chief Constable of the Greater Manchester Police, former head of the anti-terror squad in the north of England. This is a little of what he told me.
I think that this country would find it very difficult to react to the level that the French reacted. I thought it was a masterclass, really, in how to deal with an immediate emergency. They hit the ground running. There seemed to be an awful lot of police officers ready there with the best will in the world. Even pre-cuts, I think that the British police, because of the sort of people we are, an unarmed police force, would have found it difficult to achieve the speed of response that the Parisians particularly did.
Quick response from that, if you would.
Well, I don't agree. I think our police are among the best in the world. So I wouldn't put it in the same way. I think that the key priority has to be preventing these things from happening, and we do that every day. Counter-terrorism saves lives every single day in this country. One arrest on average every day. Every single day someone's arrested who wants to do us harm. In the last 6 months there have been 7 significant terrorist attacks that have been prevented. All that stuff is behind the scenes. None of us are aware of the details. We don't know what conversations are happening, what surveillance is happening, but we do know that it's the intelligence services, counter-terrorism, are saving us day in, day out, and we should be very grateful for that. And that I'd rather be in that position than the Paris position.
David's in Bracknell. We're through to Zac Goldsmith. David, go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I'm just interested to know Zac's view on the government's community work programme, which is funded in large part by the European Social Fund.
Well, it's not something that I've had to deal with as a constituency MP. I think there is a problem generally in the work programme approach that we have today, in the sense that it is too disjointed. One of the things that I'm calling for, and I think is going to happen, and actually I think most people are calling for, is for the devolution of skills funding, further education, so that you can give local authorities the power to ensure that people are trained to do jobs that actually exist. So you have an absolute bridge between the skills training and the gaps in the market. And I think that's something that really has to happen. Otherwise you have a situation. I was talking to a constituent yesterday who is about as qualified as you could possibly be in IT, long history of work doing very complicated stuff that I could never do, whose only outlet so far, the only job that's been offered, is to drive a truck, and it just seems mad. So I would like to see a much more coordinated approach. I think if we do that, then we'll provide people with the jobs that are appropriate to them, and if they, and top that up with the kind of training that's necessary to ensure that people can flourish. That it's a disjointed system at the moment. It doesn't really work. It's about getting people out of the door as quickly as possible, and I think we could have a more sophisticated approach, which would probably end up saving money as well.
7 minutes before 9. Let's come to some of the emails, texts and tweets that have come in, Mr. Goldsmith. This comes from Wendy in West Wickham. Does Zac Goldsmith support the junior doctors?
I am seeing a whole bunch of junior doctors in a few days' time, constituents. I mean, look, I've been in communication with the Secretary of State. He tells me, as he tells junior doctors, that no one is going to be required to work more hours and no one is going to see a pay cut. Now, I understand that the junior doctors don't believe that. They don't believe that because if you're going to have extended coverage in the NHS, you need, in order to honour the promise made by the Secretary of State, you need to have more money and you need to recruit more people. So he needs to demonstrate that he intends to do that. He needs to make it clear to people, he needs to prove to junior doctors that his promise about no pay cut and no increased hours will hold true. Because at the moment, it's more about suspicion than fact. And I think he is in a position, he's the only person in a position to reassure people. So that's what I'm asking him to do. I understand why he's doing what he's doing, but he needs to accept the fact that there is a level of mistrust there in the sector, that junior doctors don't believe the promises they're hearing, and he is in a position where he can put those doubts to rest, and that's what I'm asking him to do.
Or we all go to mediation.
Well, if what the Secretary of State is saying is correct, then there's no need for mediation. There's, most people want to.
But they're not exactly a bunch of Trotskyists, are they, doctors?
No,
we've got a 98% vote for strike action on a 76% turnout.
But I think certainly based on my communication and meetings with junior doctors in my patch, it's based on suspicion, not on fact. And if that's right, and if the Secretary of State is right, then he needs to bend over backwards to ensure, to demonstrate to people that the assurances he's making are correct. I can't do that, obviously. I'm not the Secretary of State, but I'm trying to persuade him to do that, and I know that colleagues are as well.
Keith says, please ask Mr Goldsmith if electric cars could use bus lanes to ease congestion.
I think in the short term that should happen, but I think...
Wow, so if I get myself an electric car...
I think that should happen. This is a question I have put to people in TfL who will give me a chapter and verse as to why that can't happen. I can't think of any reason why in the short term, in the immediate term, as a perk, as an incentive to get people to buy electric cars, this should happen. But I think that if I am right, and I'm absolutely convinced I am, that we're going to see a massive transformation, a massive shift in the type of cars that people own, then within 2 or 3 years there would be no point having bus lanes because everyone's going to be driving these things around. But I think that when you provide convenience for people, it's the biggest incentive of all, which is like the bridge crossings to the east of London. If you're creating new bridges, that is a massive opportunity to say, you know what, we're going to create this wonderful new convenience, but you can only use it if you drive the most unpolluting cars.
Phil is in Maida Vale. You're through to Zac Goldsmith. Phil, go ahead.
Hi there, Zac. How you doing?
Very good, thank you. How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad. I'm a black cab driver. I've just got to say, you said about the card readers.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you know, but there's a certain company that's giving out free card readers anyway. And TfL have just finished the consultation. And the word is that we're going to be mandatory to get card readers anyway. So I don't really see much substance in what you're saying to help the black cab trade.
Well, I hope you're right. I hope you're right about the TfL making it mandatory. I don't know if you're talking about iZettle. Is that right?
Correct.
So iZettle, at the moment, iZettle are not offering the terminals free. They're offering them at a discount. It's 2% charge, which is probably about right. You want to keep it to 2 or 3%. But the terminal itself comes on a contract. And the average contract, and I accept that it changes from business to business, but depending on the size of the business, but the average contract is about £30 per month. So it could end up costing a fair bit of money. There is an alternative where you can buy it outright at a big discount. What I'd like to get to a point to do, because this is a new thing that would be mandated, cabs would have to do this. I think the obligation would be to find a way to do it at zero cost to cabbies. Look, TfL are moving in this direction. I've been talking to TfL. I've been looking at the surveys they have been conducting. There's a huge demand for this. There's a huge demand even among black cab drivers. So I suspect they are moving in this direction, and I hope so. And it's a commitment that I hope TfL will be making very soon.
Len in Charlton has emailed, now that the Airports Commission has ruled in Heathrow's favour, will Mr Goldsmith stop his opposition and allow this city to move on?
I think, look, I had Howard Davis, who chaired that commission, came to Parliament the other day and answered questions to a committee. I was on that committee. He has accepted that, there are lots of areas in which I disagree with him, but he has accepted that the Volkswagen scandal completely changes the picture in relation to air quality. It would be impossible for the government to go ahead with Heathrow expansion if it cannot be demonstrated that Heathrow expansion is reconcilable with the air quality limits that we are legally obliged to adhere to in London and across the UK. And it is not. It is impossible to reconcile the two. All the assumptions that were made in the Airports Commission were based on data which we now know to be fraudulent. So as far as I'm concerned...
Well, there's not going to be another review, is there?
No, I don't think they need a review, but they need to look at those figures. And if I were the government right now, and I'm not going to pretend I'm objective, I'm very hostile to Heathrow expansion, but I would like the government to say, look, the choice we've been given is Heathrow and Gatwick. Both those airports need to go away and come back and prove to us that the plans that they want us to go ahead with are reconcilable with air quality targets. And if that were to happen, I don't know the answer for Gatwick, but I certainly know that Heathrow would not be able to provide that reassurance because it's impossible.
Tracy in Mill Hill, I want to take Zac Goldsmith, this will be the last one actually, by the way. Tracy in Mill Hill, I want to take Mr. Goldsmith away from London matters and ask him, does he support the Schengen zone in Europe?
Look, I don't. I would like Britain to have control over its borders. I think the rest of Europe have to make that decision for themselves. We're not part of Schengen, but we do have porous borders. And I think one of the key things for a sovereign country is an ability to control our borders, to determine who gets in and in what numbers. And I think it's a really important part of the negotiations that David Cameron is pursuing. It's one of the red lines as far as I'm concerned in relation to these negotiations. I am very, very pro-immigration on so many different levels, but I would like us to be able to have I'd like us to have an approach which is more sophisticated than the approach at the moment, which is where we have a huge number of people coming in from Europe, and because we need to meet some arbitrary immigration cap, it means we have a perverse approach to our old Commonwealth friends. So if you're coming from India, it's almost impossible now to get a visa. If you're coming from within Europe, there's no controls there at all. I would like to have a global approach, and you can't do that unless you have control of your borders.
And lastly, on a slightly related issue, you are, of course, MP for Richmond Park and North Kings, Conservative MP. Where are you with Mr. Cameron's suggestion that we might need to start bombing Syria, Mr. Goldsmith?
Can I make one point? This is an important one, because the media have lost sight of this. The narrative is that we voted against it a couple of years ago, and now we're going to be asked to vote again. We didn't vote against it a couple of years ago. It was a completely different question. We were being asked a couple of years ago whether or not we wanted to take on Assad. If we vote again, it will not be whether or not we take on Assad, it's whether or not we take on Assad's enemies, i.e. ISIS. So it's the diametric opposite. Couldn't be more further removed from the vote we were being asked the decision we were being asked to take a couple of years ago. And I think people need to bear that in mind. I would like that my impulse absolutely is to support the government in doing whatever it needs to do to take on ISIL. But the government will have to explain to us during the debate in Parliament what success looks like. How's it going to work? How's it going to make Britain safer? My starting point, absolutely go for it. Want to do it. I would love to be persuaded. But the government does need to persuade us as it needs to persuade the rest of the country.
Thank you for your time, Zac Goldsmith, Conservative MP, Richmond Park and North Kingston, of course, Conservative candidate for Mayor of London. Thank you very much indeed. The conversation continue and the calls continue. Coming up after the news here on LBC, the 9 o'clock news, your calls to Ross McEwen, Chief Executive of the Royal Bank of Scotland. That's after the news.
There's a danger that we all go away and panic about what happened in Paris. Terrible, terrible events that we're all very, very shocked by. But it's my job to put in place plans to keep them safe. And that's what we've been announcing over these few days. So the first thing I've done is to order that there will be more